What I am going to tell you belongs to modern institutional economics, which I think is the most important part of economics, if not of all social sciences. I tell it modern because Adam Smith, the father of economics, was a great institutional economist. There has been a revival of this important branch of economics in the last 50 or more years, but it's still a lot to be done. So this is evolving. And I think there are four basic tasks. The first, as in every science, one has to standardize the concepts. One manifestation of the backwardness of social sciences is the lack of standardization of the concepts. So people has a lot of confusion. And then measurement. So Bob Lawson told you about increases in measurement, which are very, very, very important. So this is the introduction. Then, based on that, one has to say which combinations of institutions on a territory of a country or above that country can coexist, can lastingly coexist. I am coming to that in a minute. Because not all combinations can lastingly exist. And sometimes bad combinations exist, which means they are systems. Third, and by far most important from the practical point of view, is the relationship between variation of institutional systems and variation of various quality, dimensions of the quality of life. That's hugely important, hugely. Variation across time, which means changes, or across space, cross-country, for example. And fourth is the dynamics of institutional system. Why do they change or don't change? And dynamics depends on the nature of the system. So there are linkages. For example, a highly centralized system is very rigid until it breaks, and it may take time. Highly decentralized systems, which we call free market economy, depend very much on bottom-up changes. So they display quite a different dynamics. This bottom-up changes can be hampered or can be distorted by state intervention, even in the free societies. Now, in the fourth topic, we have first the economics of institutional change, and the most interesting and probably most speculative is the political economy. Just to give you one example, when the Chinese have started in the late 70s to dismantle socialism in the economy, but not the Russians, not the Soviets. Why not? This is something for the historian, not for the theoreticians. Now, I am going to focus on the third point, which is this relationship between variation of institutional regimes and various dimensions of the quality of life. And in doing that, I am going to rely on a vast empirical research. Not all is known, but much is known. And thus is an attempt to summarize and to order this in an analytical frame. Now, I'm going to discuss these 5 major dimensions later. They define various types of the economic system, institutional system. Just to make sure, I define institutional system as potentially lasting combination of various forms of values of these institutional variables. And what is behind lasting? It may be good performance, which is, however, not sufficient to defend good system. This is why we have intrusion of statism in many Western countries. Or it may be fear and intimidation. Now, another remark is the distinction. Systems and policies are often confused and overlapping. Some people say rate of exchange regime is a system, and other people call it policies. So one has to define it. and delimited. And I defined policies as actions of ruling politicians. These actions may result in a change of the institutional system, and they are then called reforms, or may rely, so they change institutions, or may be like monetary policy. They do not affect institutions, but certain very important economic variables, like rate of exchange. Okay, so two kinds of policies. Now, there is a very important relationship between the nature of the system and the menu or set of policies. They overlap, but there are very important differences. And now to illustrate that, in the regime with a heavy concentration of political power, call it socialist or communist, potential policies include the genocide and mass destruction of the economy. Mass destruction of the economy was shown yesterday based on an example of Venezuela. Why? For the simple reason that in regimes with a heavy concentration of political power, there are no limitations, no external limitations to the ruler or his clique. So what's going on depends on the conscience. And the worst rulers do not have conscience. And even not pathological rulers may be corrupted by power. So the best insurance against very bad policies is division of powers, which first of all includes independent justice system. Police, prosecutors, and judges. Every dictatorship has a politically dependent justice system. This is very operational. You have to look what is going on. Another remark is that in the mainstream economics, financial crises are often blamed on markets. And there are textbooks which show that markets are inherently fragile. That comes from Keynes, or it was strengthened by Keynesian message. This is empirically wrong. There's a lot of research which shows that behind or at the bottom of the financial crisis, both in 19th century and 20th century, were various combinations of bad policies which reduced the risk for the participants of the financial markets, including state ownership of the banks, or politicization of the banking system is very, very dangerous in the long run. But we have a mainstream economics, which still is being taught in most universities, which blames the market. It is, in any case, very fashionable in the West to blame the markets and then to look to the politicians as saviors. Now, this is introduction, and now let me just an illustration. I am sure Bob have been showing this. We have various measures of these most important variables, which can be used in the empirical research, like the nature of political regime, extent of civil liberties. You see huge differences. So I just selected countries which differ the most. Rule of law, specifically defined. Now, economic freedom.
Can you hold that a bit more?
Pardon? This is just an introduction, so you can consult what is much better. I can return to this if you are interested, but this is just, I wanted to show you that this is measurable. These main dimensions are measurable. And finally, which is least known, is the fiscal stance, which is, you see the diagram, which shows on the vertical axis social spending as a percentage of GDP. And on the horizontal axis, you have GDP per capita. So what is striking? Huge variation. You see? Very weak correlation between the level of per capita income and social spending, which means that at every level of social spending, you have huge variation. which cannot be explained by the level of social spending. You might have heard about something which is called Wagner law. This is a German economist who formulated something he called law, but it's not a law. He said that the richer a country, the higher the percentage of GDP spent on social policy, but it's not exactly true. So look at the poorest countries, and you see the Ukraine, which is still poor, even though it's growing now, have very high percentage of social spending to GDP, while, say, Jamaica have below 10%, Ukraine above 35%. You may find Israel, which is pretty high, but still below most European countries, and this is good for you. But pretty high. Now, you might be surprised that US have a higher percentage of social spending than Canada, than Switzerland. Because why surprised? Because you hear various voices, there is no social welfare state in the US. That's not true. US have pretty large but very badly structured welfare state. And there are interesting outliers. If you look at Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Korea, they have very low social spending compared to countries at a similar level of per capita income. One of the reasons China has been growing so fast since late 70s is that they increased the dose of economic freedom. They de facto abandoned socialism, but they kept social spending under control, which meant that GDP was growing very fast and social spending was growing slowly. So they've got for 30% of social spending to GDP in the late 30s to below 20%. So what was their welfare state? Economic growth, which is the best welfare state. Okay, so now let me come to the institutions. You can create many typologies. I am attached to this because it is based on very important and measurable dimensions. Now, democracy have 100 definitions. Most of them are wrong. I think the best definition was supplied by great economist Joseph Schumpeter, an Austrian, who defined democracy as an open competition in politics expressed in free elections. Not the will of the people, etc., which is not measurable. This. Now, civil rights, you know, this is what you take for granted here. Freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, etc., etc. It's very important dimension because without civil rights you don't have civil society. But civil society includes lobbies. It also includes anti-market lobbies, which could not and should not be prohibited. This is freedom. So what to do? Be stronger in organizing for the defense of freedom. Now, without civil rights, there is no democracy. Because if you prohibit no civil rights, no competition, no political competition. But you still may have elections, which are pseudo-elections. Now, rule of law, extremely important dimension, which has many, many definitions. I am not going into that. To put it simply, first, in a rule of law country, nobody is above the law, including the politicians. The law includes a large dose of freedoms, and there is no powerful secret police. These are just some characteristics. And you see, when can you appreciate what is the rule of law? In dictatorships. It's like health. You know what you are lacking. So it is characteristic that in dictatorship, people are elite is above the law, and the elite rules through intimidation. And for intimidation, you need powerful secret police. Obviously, there is no democracy without the rule of law. Why? Because you can imprison your competitor. Mr. Navalny in Russia, the leader of the opposition, has been imprisoned many times and then deprived of his voting rights as a candidate by the courts. So you see, what we call liberal democracy, in fact, is a combination of three features. Democracy is an open competition, civil rights, and the rule of law. And if you weaken rule of law or civil rights, you lower the level of political competition until it does not exist, until it disappears. And you have elections without choice. Okay, now economic freedom is extremely important, but often neglected in social sciences, especially by sociologists, anthropologists, who like to be different from economists. So they stress, they disregard. Why the economic freedom is so important? Because first, we know from lots of empirical research that differences in economic freedom sharply differentiate rate of growth. I am coming to that. This is empirical. But secondly, we know that if economic freedom is very much curtailed, there is no democracy. I am coming to that. So, because then economy is state-dominated, and if economy is state-dominated, politicians have the power about employment and reward system and punishment. And such an economy has to perform very badly. That's empirical, compared to market economies. So how to sustain the system? By intimidation. So you can't give people civil rights. You give them what? What dictators love to give? Social rights, but not freedoms. And what has happened after the Second World War was a growing confusion about a very important term which is called rights. Initially, in the 19th century, rights meant freedom rights, which demanded limits on the state actions. In 20th century, something completely different was added under the same name, rights, which meant the state is distributing money or various benefits, and this was lumped together into one term, rights, and codified in various official documents, UN, including by the UN. And you have total confusion. By the way, this is one of the problems with social sciences, which are captured by political bodies. So one has to be very, very careful in addressing the official language. Now, so these are the main dimensions which I have measured, and now a few types of a system based on the dimension. Now, I already referred to a system based on fear, but let me repeat, this is socialism. Some people are so much in love with the word socialism that they prefer the term communism. But it's the same. The essence, the primary feature of socialism was the replacement of private ownership and markets by the monopoly of state ownership and central planning, which means commands and allocations from above, and this was faithful to Marx. It is not contrary to Marx, as many Marxists. Marx envisaged socialism as anti-capitalism, so completely opposite. So no private ownership and no economic freedom, and such a socialism was introduced by force for the first time by Bolsheviks in Russia, and then spread by force in Central Eastern Europe. Then in the late 40s, it was introduced by China, in China. Now, once you prohibit economic freedom, as I already explained, you can't have civil rights. You can't have rule of law. But what must you have? Powerful KGB. So if you look for the operational definition of socialism, it's KGB. KGB, of course, it's a name for the secret police. And every socialist country has its KGB. After the Soviets, the great specialists were East Germans, which exported their expertise in secret police. And secret police was, of course, an instrument of intimidation. And to resist required to be a hero. So there were some heroes in USSR. It required much more courage to resist than in Poland, because socialism in Poland, even though very bad, was not as harsh as in as USSR or in GDR. Now, what remained today of socialism? Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela is just a chaos. It's very different to speak about a system, but you see how, compared to the situation in the 70s, the geographical range of socialists shrank enormously. First, China, we may discuss it later, de facto abandoned socialism by opening the economy and letting private sector grow. In Chinese economy is about 80% private, even though the party who governs is called communism. And that's why many people say, oh, in China there's communism. I'm not praising this regime because it's very inhuman, but it's not socialist. Then there are many quasi-socialist countries, almost socialist. In Europe, Belarus, Central Asia, Venezuela, many Arab countries are de facto quasi-socialist in a sense that the state sector is dominating. It may be operated by military or other bodies, but the private sector is relatively small. South Arabia is de facto socialist because most of the economy is oil, and oil is state-owned. Iran is de facto quasi-socialism because most of the economy is state-owned, and a big chunk of it is in the operation by revolutionary guards. Egypt, to some extent, is quasi-socialist, and there's no surprise that quasi-socialist countries are performing badly because they are politicized. Then the opposite could be a perfectly or highly decentralized system, call it free market capitalism. By definition, it has extensive economic freedom within the framework of the rule of law. There is no freedom without the rule of law in a state. And we all live in the states. Nowadays, these are mostly democratic countries. And only few countries would correspond to this definition. I was looking for some examples which would be the closest. I think it's Switzerland, Ireland, Hong Kong. Most other countries which are called Western capitalistic, and they are capitalistic in the sense that most of the economy is private, would fall in the big category over-regulated and or fiscally unstable, or too much status. This is a very mixed bag. But you have over-regulation, certainly in Italy, France, fiscal problems in these two countries. There have been some reforms after the financial crisis, but still, which shows that how under political freedoms and civil rights one has to defend economic freedom. because this all happened under political freedom. So there is no, without defense, the groups which are opposed to economic freedom because of their commercial interests or ideology would win. It is very fashionable in the West to be against capitalism. You can sell millions of copies of anti-capitalistic books, and many Hollywood movies are directed against corporations, but not against big government. So there's a certain bias which has to be corrected. It is not going to disappear. You know, to be against capitalism while living under capitalism is non-risky and may be very lucrative. To be against socialism while living under socialism was very risky and was not lucrative. So this is why this anti-capitalistic fashion is morally cheap and factually wrong. But this shows you the power of status ideology. And finally, you have systems which are not socialist, but display bad capitalism, and are usually called crony capitalists. What is the definition? Private ownership exists as a legal category, and in fact, but it's very unequally protected. There is a group of people who may be politicians, brother of the politicians, colleague of the politicians, who enjoy very extreme protection, including the possibility to rob other people. This is called raiderstvo in Russian, and this is a system which I understand has evolved after 91 in Russia and was codified and strengthened by Mr. Putin. But you have also other examples like Kazakhstan. There was a different system of oligarchs in Ukraine, which is, however, in the process of change. And it's a different story. Now, it is easy to understand why crony capitalism is bad. First, it is immoral, unequal treatment of people. Second, it's not very efficient because it stifles competition. Because you have privileged group and other businesses, and a lot of uncertainty, because you never know, being normal businessman, when and whether you are going to be robbed. But not by ordinary robbers, by state administration. Prosecutors, KGB, you may be falsely accused, etc., etc. So much for the definitions. Pardon? Singapore is an outlier. You know, if you look at the population of non-democratic states, you have to look at the distribution always. You find some good outliers, but they are very, very infrequent. So this is why they are not representative for the whole category. You find many more Mobutu or Mugabes than rulers of Singapore. The repression in Singapore is much less, but still exists. But they give a lot of economic freedom. Like to some extent, perhaps, in Chile under Pinochet, even though he was much harsher. And thanks to economic freedom and the rule of law, Singapore has been growing. But never, once again, it is a fallacy to generalize from non-representative cases. You have to look at whole population, and then and generally speaking, again, this is empirical observation, the worse autocracies are much worse than the worst democracies. Compare Stalin Russia with Greece nowadays. You can have economic catastrophes under worse democracies, but not genocide. And economic catastrophe under democracy has been not as deep as economic catastrophe under worse non-democracies. So one advice, always compare, but compare populations, not single selected cases. Yes?
China?
Pardon?
China, where do you put it?
China is a country which is in between, because this does not capture, certainly it's not socialist according to classical definition, it's an autocracy, and it's one of the few autocracies which has been economically successful, but very bad on human rights, very bad. On classical liberties and the rule of law.
And how about Saudi Arabia?
Pardon?
How about Saudi Arabia?
Of course, autocracy of a different kind, but economically backward because very much dependent on oil, and it's extremely biased composition of the population. Natives have public jobs, and they do not work much, so they are demoralized, and the work is done mostly by the foreigners. I understand the new Crown Prince tries to change this pathological situation. Okay, but let me come now to the links between various dimensions of institutional systems or the systems and the main dimensions of the quality of life. Quality of life should not be measured just by one figure. There are several distinct dimensions, and I think the most important are the following ones. The long-term growth of consumption, which is only possible if you have a long-term economic growth. The second, employment. What is the situation on the labor market? Third, health. Fourth, types of inequalities. By the way, nowadays the most confusion is about inequalities, and capitalism is bashed by anti-capitalists under the slogan of inequalities. Only in the West, Thomas Piketty could be called a new Marx, and this is taken as a compliment. Compliment to be called new Marx. And something which sounds very soft, which is self-realization and fear. And you can link this empirically to the differences in institutional systems. To be sure, there are some correlations between the determinants. For example, economic growth is linked to some extent to health, and health matters to economic growth above the certain level. If people are undernourished, they cannot be productive. But above that, the reverse link is weaker. Of course, there is a link between economic growth and employment, both ways, and also inequalities. I am coming to that, but let me now make a brief overview. What we know. Now, this is just analytical scheme, which shows that there are some other determinants of some of these dimensions of quality of life than institutional variables, because initial conditions always matter. Why China was growing much faster in the late 70s, early 80s than Russia? Many people blame only the Russian strategy under Yeltsin. It is wrong. In China, there was a huge potential which did not exist in Russia. In China was mostly an agrarian economy, which was very badly organized in nonsensical communes, which were disbanded. And land was given in a long lease to peasants. And this was a revolution, which could not be generated in Russia, because in Russia, agriculture was a minority, and it was very difficult to privatize. So China, initial conditions matter. You always have to consider differences. Climate, well, I don't know many countries are discriminated by climate. You can find good performers in the tropics. For example, relatively good performer is Vietnam. And if there are some outliers, they are only outliers. So majority of countries are not hit by very bad climate, I think. Location, this is a different story because except for Israel, if you are situated on the desert, it's pretty difficult to grow. But again, on a small subsection of countries discriminated against by nature. In the large countries, like Canada and Russia, you find regions which are very difficult for economic development. It is Siberia in Russia, and it is up north in Canada. So it is the best to leave them to the wildlife and to concentrate economic activity in a better part, which has happened in Canada, and now it is happening in Russia. Previously, there was a nonsensical attempt to locate plants, regardless of the climate. Natural resources, a mixed blessing. They are better for the world, but it is better for a country not to have them in abundance. And demography, which is to some extent linked to economic growth, matters. If you have a decline in increases in the working life population, this is not the case, I understand, in Israel. Now, just to speed up. Very briefly, what do we know from a lot of research? The long-term economic growth depends very much on economic freedom. So deprivation of economic freedom or serious damage to economic freedom makes it impossible to grow fast over longer term. Intensity of market competition, very, very important. There's no substitute for market competition as far as innovations are concerned. And finally, rule of law. I would say this triangle, the most important things, will be defended and expanded. Now, these are illustrations just to remind you that modern economic growth is very recent. It started only 200 years ago, more or less. And this is a miracle, which meant that for the overwhelming part of human history, people lived in extreme poverty, except for the elite. This shows the variation of economic growth after socialism, which Bob has mentioned. That's true that Poland achieved the fastest increase in the Central and Eastern Europe, except for Albania. And this reflects differences in economic strategy, mostly. Meaning that more comprehensive and radical reforms, especially if initiated early, brought about much faster economic growth than alternative strategies. And what's interesting is that so-called social indicators have improved more in Poland than economic indicators, which falsify the statement that economic growth was achieved at the costs of something. Now, very briefly, there are links between economic growth and the situation in the labor market. The best situation is that all working age people work. This is an ideal. And there's approximation. There are huge differences in employment ratio. So first factor is again the nature, how dynamic is the economy, how many private sector jobs it creates. That's most important, the supply side. But then you have other factors, labor market regulations, especially the difficulty to dismiss people, discourage private employers to hire them in the first place. That was documented by OECD, among others. And everybody who is employed likes to be defended by law, but in total it's very, very dangerous. Then I'm going to discuss it tomorrow. We have various bad combinations of taxation and welfare subsidies which discourage people from working. Not all welfare states, but the worst are like that. And finally, if you have pockets of bad education, then you create unemployment. And this is, among other countries, I think to some extent true of the United States. One of the reasons why Trump has won was that he addressed the losers. But the losers were the victims of bad education. Health. There is, again, empirical research which shows that richer countries tend to be healthier, and there are some links. But above the certain level, this probably stops. And in some richer countries, people tend to overeat, which is not very healthy. But there is to some extent independent force, independent from the economic growth, which is a role of curative medicine, especially diseases, mass diseases. And one of the phenomena of Africa is that most of these countries are performing rather better economically, but thanks to a modern medicine, there is a fast growth of the population. And the big question is, what next? What next? Where would they migrate to? Who is the closest? That's illustrations. You see differences in mass indicators like life expectancy. What was typical for most socialist countries was a big gap in life expectancy between male and female. Women tend to live longer. So I sometimes joke they were more tolerant of socialism. But the true reason was that men tend to drink a lot of vodka. And vodka in large quantities is not good for your health. So, if this drinking habit persisted, then the gap is maintained. And in Russia, in parts of Latvia, Kazakhstan, it has been reduced in Poland because younger generation is switching to beer and wine. Now, I can discuss it later, but as I said, it's a lot of confusion about the term inequality. Everybody is against inequality. Is it right or not? It's wrong. Because you have to first start, what kind of inequality do you have in mind? The basic distinction, just to remind you, is about inequality of situation, including income, and inequality of chance. Now, we all, in the modern world, accept the ideal of zero inequality of chance, meaning that people should achieve the positions they deserve because of their inherent characteristics, so they should not be discriminated against because of their family background, etc., etc. Yes? There's one exception to this. If you want to achieve perfect inequality, you would have to abolish family, which would be absurd. Because family background, the best education is in the family, so you can't. But with this exception, striving to achieve, to be closer to equality of opportunity is correct, both morally, but also economically, because more talented people move to more productive positions. What about inequality of income? Is it the same that it should be zero? Of course not. And then you see the difference. They are completely two different concepts, which are often confused. Now there's a link between inequalities and systems. Under socialism, there was huge inequality in power, but reduced inequality of income, at least officially. When you move away from socialism towards democracy, market economy, you change the inequalities. Inequalities in power are reduced. Inequalities in income increase because you allow entrepreneurs and inventors. So inequality should be analyzed in a dynamic setting. Okay, I am finishing and then just 2 minutes. Now, self-realization sounds very sociological, but it's an important concept. It means that self-realization is achieved when individuals have a serious chance to meet their realistic aspirations. Okay? So it's linked to equality of opportunity, but also there is a second dimension. In systems, when the range of possibilities is very limited, many talented people cannot meet their aspirations. More concretely, under socialism, there are very important roles of private entrepreneur, independent journalists, independent publishers were banned. What was left? To work for the state bureaucracy or to enter more suspicious jobs. So this was a waste of human capital because of the nature of the system. And the last point, which is very, very important, but not, to my knowledge, not directly measured, is fear. Intimidation and fear. As I said, the worst system can persist because of machinery of intimidation and fear. There are two cases. First, what is called failed states, which are no states. It's worse than traditional societies, when functionaries, state functionaries with Kalashnikov rob and kill other people, say Somalia, until at least recently, Haiti until recently, etc. But the most important fact is despotic states. And the worst despotism was socialism, and these are the features. So you have to criminalize any attempt to perform freedom actions, including entrepreneur. So you have socialist crimes, and you have judges and policemen who prosecute you. Secondly, as I mentioned, you have to have a powerful secret police which to some extent acts around the law by killing or blackmailing, etc. And finally, if you have state-dominated economy, you can punish people by depriving them of the jobs, rewarding them by giving them rewards, etc. So you have various systems of intimidation. And this is why this system can last. And it was a miracle that empire of evil, to use Reagan words, disappeared. It went beyond the dreams of most people. Now, there are also some problems with the justice systems in liberal democracies, but they are of a completely different dimension and nature than in the despotic states. I end with that, without concluding comments, and the floor is yours. I hope you are not intimidated. Yes.
I want to ask about the distinction between inequality of opportunities and inequality of income. I think that in some way there is connection between inequality in income and inequality of opportunities. Like, because if we talk about the education as a base for employment, so the opportunities, where is private education, the opportunities for education and then get employment is depending on your income. And if you look on mobility in the society, it's like you mentioned Piketty, it said that we look about income, so we look on income, so there is a lot of mobility, but if we look at capital, so still there is no real mobility, and maybe it's because the inequality of income, inequality of capital is not letting us give a real inequality of opportunity.
One has to distinguish conceptual distinction from empirical distinction. First of all, you have to distinguish concepts which denote things which are linked, but they are completely two different things. Okay? So first, conceptual clarity. Only then you can address the factual problem. And the factual problem you raise is important, of course. There's a link between certain values of income inequality and certain values of mobility. Okay? So one cannot say they are completely independent. And one still, there are some measures which would reduce the impact of large differences in income and wealth of the parents on the chances of the offspring. And you know more or less what this is: basic education. Trying to give good chances for people from poorer backgrounds as far as the education is concerned. Health. This does not need to be state-owned, but has to exist. I will discuss it yesterday. But if you try to reduce very much the inequality of income in order to reduce its impact upon equality of opportunity, you can harm something which is very important: economic growth. Okay? And there's also the question, which is a moral question: what is the legitimacy of reducing the role of the family by the state actions? So there are some complex, I do not deny, there are some complex links, but I think more or less we know what will be the best measures to address these links when they are dangerous to the equality of opportunity. But the question is very important. Yes?
How do you measure inequality and opportunities?
Or you have various measures which were devised. For example, there's a proxy which is called social mobility, which means you look at, say, poor families and look what happens to its offspring, their offspring, children, yes? And you count the percentage of children for poor families which achieve a better status than the parents. But look, there is to some extent the limit to social mobility when you achieved a lot of social mobility already. Because when you have it, you have a meritocratic selection. Meritocratic based on the IQ and other features, inborn features, or other features of individuals. And then, what next? Then, this was addressed by some US thinkers. You may have a stratification of society into people with better mental qualities, who advance because of their mental qualities, and other people. And this is a tricky question, because it's very awkward to discuss. But it was discussed. And finally, if you have, assume for a moment, you have a fixed number of better jobs. This is not completely true in dynamic economy, but to focus on that, assume. Then if you want the mobility, people who are children of the people at the top would have to go down, so that to make a room for the children from poorer families, under this assumption of fixed number of places, which is more or less true of what? Bureaucracy, political system. So what is the solution to this dilemma? Dynamic economy. Dynamic private economy. So without the dynamic private economy, like in socialism, there was stop to mobility. With the introduction of socialism, children from poorer parts of society move forward, but then the second generation and third generation tend to occupy good places for their children. Yes?
In Israel, a lot of small groups, minorities, okay? But eventually, when it comes to study at school, not to university, high school, elementary school, it comes to two groups: those who study in Arabic and those who study in Hebrew. You know? So most of them, when they choose to study in Arabic, in my opinion, they choose to be in the status of inequality because when they grow up, they don't know the language very good, or they can't get access to the system very good, they can't get to the function very good. So I'm asking you from your experience, do you think that they choose this status, okay, and knowing that in the future they're going to harm themselves, okay, and eventually they say, okay, there's inequality. So this unawareness, from one extreme, taking them to the place that they are not going to be that successful maybe, from the other extreme, they choose that.
That's a very tricky question. I have no more about, but certainly if you assume a liberal ideal, you respect the people's decisions. But then you require from people who make a decision to bear responsibility. And responsibility means that they should not demand them permanent subsidies. This is according to liberal ideal. Freedom plus responsibility. Of course, what would help, if possible, to have a lot of good communication informing them about the future consequences. It's probably the best I can think of. Very expressive, good communication, showing concrete examples. This is your future. This is your future if you study Hebrew. This is your future if you don't know. Yes?
My question is about the way that people in your country accepted your ideas after the communist regime. How was it? They for decades they knew something really specific about communism, and then it came the opposite idea. So how did
people hated communism under communism, at least in Poland. So there were less convinced communists in the Communist Party than in France. Why? Because they knew it. So they did not know communists only from the books. In reality, that did not mean that I understood capitalism, but certainly they strongly disliked. Ordinary people, because of queues, the lack of opportunities, but also most people because of propaganda, which was based on huge permanent lies, intimidation. In Poland in 1980, quite surprisingly, we had a mass movement, which was called Solidarity. You might have heard of Lech Wałęsa, who was the leader. He was an electrician, very clever, because electricians know how to be clever. They could get electric shock. And this was completely unexpected. And the Communist Party was taken by surprise, so Solidarity grew. And it was a mass movement of many people from various workers, intellectuals, etc. Well, it was suppressed because it was against the system, but existed for more than almost 1 year and a half months, 1 year and a half, and it showed the dislike. But even then, nobody dared, including myself as a young reformer, to propose capitalism. Why? Because we knew this would provoke Red Army and this justification. So we've been searching for something not completely socialist, as much autonomy to the enterprises, which meant labor management, something of the sort. And this was unrealistic too, because it would have required the elimination of party controls over the managers. Nomenclatura system. It was unrealistic. I have proposed this. It was not accepted, yes. But I'm telling you this an example. The second point was that in Poland in '89, there was a special atmosphere. First, the feeling there is an economic catastrophe, as it was, because it was hyperinflation, prices were growing at 1,000% a year, production was declining, shortages were increased, so people expected improvement. Secondly, there was a feeling of liberation, something So I call it the period of extraordinary politics. And during such a period, it is easier than normal to push reforms which are usually regarded as difficult. So the best solution was to move forward as fast as possible, not to explain what is capitalism. It was a waste of time. So this was the best use of a gift of history. But you have to be prepared. I was more or less prepared because I had a hobby. I was interested in the reforms. But I thought that this is a useless hobby, but interesting. So I have useless hobbies. They may be useful one day.
I had something more after you said. As you said, like the people of Poland didn't like the Soviet regime, the USSR. How is today the connection between the Polish people, like the business connection between Poland and Russia? Still, like people remember the things that was in the history.
Well, it has much reduced because it was artificially high. At the beginning, there was a closed system. We were open only to one side. Our brotherly countries, Comic-Con, big brothers, smaller brothers, but all brothers. At the top was a big brother. And so the most of the trade was occurring within this grouping, which was called Comic-Con. And this is very strange that people in every country thought that other countries were cheating them. So in Poland, the people thought, oh, there is shortage of meat because we're exporting meat to the Russians. And the Russians thought we are subsidizing. To some extent, they were right, I must confess, because we were getting oil and gas at low prices. But everybody was convinced, cheating. Now, so this was artificially high. Once the system collapsed, including Comic-Con, and be open to the West, there was a natural reallocation of trade to the Western countries. There was not a conscious strategy, economic forces. Then politics intervened, but later, and we have some balance of our food. So our farmers blame the authorities that they've lost markets in Russia. But this is much smaller reason compared to natural economic forces. Yes?
Your experience as a Minister of Finance, probably you went through a lot of changes in the economy. How do you think you can help parts of the population lose their jobs, probably when you have big changes? How can you actually do something to help them get a new job? How do you make them ready for the next phase in the economic growth?
In the first period, it's impossible to make a balance that everybody who loses a job immediately gets a new job. It is impossible even in the US. And the speed of changes in the first 1, 2, 3 years was enormous. In the best strategies, which was radical. So unavoidably, you got appearance of open unemployment. I say appearance because what was typical of socialism was hidden unemployment, or unemployment on the job. You did not necessarily have work, but you were employed. So there was emergence, a transformation of hidden unemployment into open unemployment. It's always much more pleasant to be unemployed on the job than outside the job. Secondly, socialists created a special economic structure. So what was overgrown compared to the structure on the comparable capitalistic economy, heavy industry, very good, raw materials sector. Why? Because under socialism you could not compete with manufacturing, especially modern manufacturing, except for the armaments. So it was very biased. We produced, for example, a lot of coal with heavy mixture of stones. Then we produced a lot of sulfur, a lot of copper. We employed 400,000 miners, now 100,000. We employed 400,000 railway workers, 100,000. What I want to say is that these socialist sectors have to shrink. Otherwise, there will be no progress. So you've got two forces at the beginning: reduction in the open unemployment, hidden unemployment, and restructuring, which was not top-down, but spontaneous result of market forces. So, but this was, of course, unpleasant to the affected people. But for the first 2 years, there were no massive protests. In overall, in the former socialist countries, there was less protests than in France in the same time. Which means what matters only is not, it's not only economic situation, but the level of organization of big labor. Later, so you have different speed. If you introduce radical reforms which are much better than slow, then the increase in open unemployment is faster than an increase in job creation. But the only solution is go on, keeping on, so that private sector can supply jobs. And after a while, you achieve a balance. Now, you practically don't have unemployment.
You don't believe in like training or stuff like that? Like you didn't
No, I believe it. I believe in efficient training. You know, what is the problem? When there are maladjustments. Private economy is very dynamic if it is allowed to operate. Education system in most countries is state-controlled, and this is why it's rigid. So there are imbalances. So the solution is to let non-state forms of education to organize and try to reform the public education if possible. Yes, Paul.
So, how do you account for the surge of popularity that's taking place today?
Second popularity war.
There's a surge of new popularity of socialism. Now, I know the grassroots reality in the United States much better than I do in Europe. But I'm just looking here. There's this Senator Sanders, Bernie Sanders, who was a pure socialist. Now, 2 years ago, his popularity rating in the United States was 12%. The latest poll is now 53%. How, given the compelling knowledge we have that people are better off in every respect under economic freedom, why do you think this is happening?
That's a fundamental question. But let me first say that what Sanders is proposing is very bad, but it's not socialist in the classical sense, because to my knowledge, he is not proposing total nationalization of the economy. He's proposing more regulations, more welfare spending, etc., which is bad, but not catastrophic. I am saying it's the US leads.
He is a major part. For instance, he wants government health care.
Okay.
Healthcare is 20% of the American economy.
So what he's suggesting probably is something which exists in Britain. I am not justifying you. I am just trying to be clear. Sanders is a populist, but it's not Marxist socialist. He's sufficiently bad for the US economy to be taken seriously. Okay. You have even worse. Le Pen, if she had won, would be even worse, because there would be nationalizations and protectionism, probably, according to what she promised. Now, your general question is a very important one, and preliminary answer would be that there's little cumulative learning across time. So in each generation has to defend freedoms, each generation, because if there were cumulative learning like in physical sciences, it would be easier. The job would be finished 100 years ago, but not. And then there's a question from the theory of communication, why it is not. I don't know exactly, but I would mean that One reason is that most of issues discussed in politics regards economics, economic issues, and there are certain incentives for some politicians to be populist, in a sense of proposing popular but bad ideas. To some extent, it is again due to the fact that I already mentioned that under Western capitalism, there is a big faction of intellectuals who propose anti-capitalistic solutions. So one would have to dig deeper, what is the reason? And you may read von Mises, von Hayek, Nozick. They gave some interesting explanation why it is so that under capitalism there are so many anti-capitalistic ideologues. Probably it is driven by vanity. You can be popular while pretending you care. So you take high moral, even though you are an idiot, you are a respective idiot because you care. You show your empathy, etc., etc. And this has to be unmasked because there is no serious discussion with charlatans. They have to be unmasked. So a very good satire, hitting them. I think it's a solution. It's probably the most effective. So, but you have effect. You have a big faction of anti-capitalistic intellectuals who influence whom? Many people. People who like to envy other people, frustrated people who are like to blame the system and establishment. And this goes on through generations. And I think it requires counteraction from the liberal forces like this institute. And most probably, I just am saying what I read, social media make the problem even worse. So we have to be better in social media. So I am now mostly on social media in Poland. I have 300,000 followers on Twitter, 90,000 on Facebook, and I'm all over TV in Poland. So the battle, the defense of freedom never ends. Yes?
I have one more question, because it also regards to what you talked a lot about rule of law.
Mm-hmm.
I know that in Poland today, there's an issue of the freedom of the courts, and also it's also something not, I don't know exactly similar, also an issue in Israel of courts. And what I understand, if it connects to what's going on in the United States, there is a feeling, a rise of populism that people feel that there are institutions that weren't elected, that they have a lot of power and over them. How do you think how can you really create a balance, and how do you see what's going on in Poland, and what can we learn from that to us?
Mm-hmm. That's a very important question. Now, you have accidents in the road traffic, but you may have accidents in politics too. We suffered an accident. And accident consisted in the fact that bad guys have good luck. It's very dangerous. You cannot plan. When bad guys have good luck, they can win elections and then can implement their theories. And the good luck continues if they inherit a booming economy, like in Poland. Now, what was the bad luck? We have 2 elections in a row. In 2015, we have presidential elections. And there was a very popular president, a decent guy, who, however, had a very bad campaign, very bad. And his opponent was nobody. At the beginning, the previous president had 70% popularity, and his competitor has 3. But the president lost elections. Now, why did it matter? Because president in Poland has a veto power over legislation. And the new president came from the now ruling party. So one bastion was lost. The second one, after presidential elections, we had parliamentary elections. And again, bad guys had good luck because they got impetus due to previous victory, plus 2 parties barely missed thresholds. If only one of them entered, it would be a completely different situation, but it did not happen, and the ruling party has a majority. And then they misuse this majority, going beyond their program. And we have an attack on the rule of law, which in operational terms means trying to capture something which has to be completely independent from the politicians, which means police, prosecutors, and judges. Now, they have not captured police. They're trying to nominate the new bosses. They radically restructure prosecution, which is a very needed but dangerous institution. What they did is centralization of decision, and at the top they have a party member, and they try to have their own prosecutors. Own meaning they would prosecute the opposition, and would not prosecute the same actions on the ruling party side. And finally, they captured Constitutional Tribunal, which analyzes the constitutionality of the rule of normal legislation, and by nominating against the Polish constitution the party functionaries, in fact. And finally, there's an attempt to capture the courts, which is not yet successful, and there's a lot of resistance. 99% of the judges resisted and opposing it. So summing up, this is the worst, which is goes well beyond what was happening in Poland until 2015, and it was totally surprising. Which, once again, accidents happen. We have a growing civil resistance among the Polish population, and we see elections, which will show the first regional elections in 2 weeks' time. But what, as I said, good luck for bad people, guys, consists only also that they achieved booming economy, not achieved, obtained, which was helped by improvement in the European Union. And in every country I know, many people think or feel that if economy is booming, that those in power do a good job. So you have to be even better on communication, to communicate the danger before the danger materializes.
But do you feel that maybe the reason they win elections because when Poland joined the European Union, so maybe there's a fear by the Polish people that there are institutions that aren't elected that have more power over them, like they're losing their democracy in some ways?
No. In most European countries, European institutions are more popular than domestic institutions, and this includes Poland. So more popularity. But there is an attempt for nationalistic propaganda to play upon sovereignty issue. By the way, the worst dictators always use sovereignty as an excuse for suppressing dissent. Which is the most sovereign country in the world? North Korea. Any other questions or remarks? Okay. Thank you very much.